All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'll first begin by um, first saying who I am. So my name is Paige Gavin. I am a second year master's student studying anthropology at the George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm also part of the Rituals in the Making research team where we study COVID commemoration and misinformation. So today I'll be moderating our seminar, Pandemic Revisionism and Social Forgetting, Intersections and Reflections. We invited two experts in their field to join us today, Dr. Katelyn Jetelina and Dr. Nancy Bristow, to help us understand this new phase of the pandemic and how we ought to comprehend the rejection of pandemic discussion in mainstream society. The way that this will be set up is that our speakers will each have 30 minutes to present on their topic, and then we will have 30 minutes of Q&A session where you, the audience, can ask any questions in the chat. We will not be using the microphone, but if you put your question into the chat, I will relay that verbally to both our speakers. So with that, I welcome our first speaker, Dr. Nancy Bristow. Dr. Bristow is an American historian specializing in 20th century America in the context of race and social change. Dr. Bristow is also the author of American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Pandemic, which uncovers the social and cultural history that shaped the public amnesia of the 1918 influenza epidemic. I will now hand it over to Dr. Bristow.
Thank you so much, Paige, and to others from the team for Rituals in the Making. Martha Greenwald, thank you. Hanan Kabir, all of you are helping make this happen today. Thank you so much. And as my remarks will make clear, I really do believe the work you're doing is profoundly important. So I have deep gratitude for that. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen as I get started here. Just give me a moment. It's not wanting to let me. Let's try that again. There we go. There we go. Before I start I want to make one other quick comment, which is to mention that I am speaking from the grounds of the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, which resides on the illegally occupied and unceded land of the Puyallup tribe of Indians. The Puyallup people have been caring and expert stewards of the land and the sea, the plants and the animals since time immemorial. And I name this to honor them and to commit myself and our university to support their struggle for justice. Okay, so in 1929, Blind Willie Johnson, a blues artist known for his gospel renditions, recorded Jesus is Coming Soon on the A side of a record for Columbia Phonograph Company. The song detailed a scourge that was running through the United States. God sent a mighty disease, he wrote, a terror that killed many 1,000 on land and on the seas. Johnson told of a society upended, with schools closed, churches closed down, and doctors who didn't know what to do. Johnson wasn't describing COVID-19, though certainly there are parallels, but he was describing the experience of Americans during the 1918 flu pandemic, which tore through the country beginning in the spring of 1918, but returned 3 times over. Experts today estimate that as many as 1/3 of humans around the globe were infected by this new incarnation of influenza, which was incorrectly named Spanish influenza, if you've heard that term. It struck with unprecedented ferocity. We don't know the figures, but certainly at least 500 million people were infected, and perhaps 50 to 100 million people worldwide died. As I say, it came in 4 waves. The first hit in the spring of 1918, and in 3 succeeding waves after. The most serious of the waves came in the fall of 1918, when in the United States, infection rates ranged between 25 and 40%. Some 675,000 Americans died over the course primarily of that fall wave, but also the next spring. And actually about 25 to 40% of people were infected. Almost 50% of the victims came from young adults between the ages of 20 and 40. So this was enough to lower life expectancy in the United States for 1918 by 12 years. This was a massive event. In his song, Blind Willie Johnson blamed Americans for their plight, suggesting that God was punishing them for their sins, and he commanded Americans to turn away from evil and seek the Lord and pray. This musical Jeremiah was one of about 30 songs that Blind Willie Johnson recorded between 1927 and 1930. Then he never recorded again. And his name is not widely known among Americans, even those who are, serious listeners to the blues. Even so, traces of his influence remain. Artists as varied as Beck, Nina Simone, Bob Dylan recorded covers of his songs. And in 2016, as you can see here on the screen, Alligator Records released a Blind Willie Johnson tribute album with performances from several leading artists as varied as Tom Waits and Sinead O'Connor. The producers chose the Cowboy Junkies to record the song on the flu pandemic, Jesus is Coming Soon. Now, in a pattern with a decades-long history, though, reviews of the album almost never mentioned the flu pandemic, which was central to one of the key songs. Even reviewers who focused especially on the song Jesus is Coming Soon failed to even mention the subject of the song, which was the flu pandemic, even when they spent a great deal of time talking about the music of the tune. Well, this tendency to leave the flu pandemic unnamed has a long history. Like Blind Willie Johnson, largely forgotten to the American public, but still having an impact, the flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920 faded from the nation's attention and ultimately its public memory in the decades that followed the pandemic. As historian Alfred Crosby described it, this was, in a sense, America's forgotten pandemic. But in reality, we probably shouldn't be that surprised about this national case of amnesia. Historians of memory note that communities and nations routinely choose to remember some episodes and forget others in order to create a version of their past that fits their sense of themselves in the past and the present and helps them imagine and dream for the futures they want. Such forgetting, though, requires the erasure of significant parts of our past and often some of the most traumatic events, a tendency that Guy Biner defines as social forgetting. Of interest to Biner and to myself, I think to all of us today, is the process by which this kind of social forgetting takes place and the role it plays in what Dr. Jetelina has termed pandemic revisionism. Biner urges us to look at what happens behind the scene when communities try or profess to try to forget discomforting historical episodes, but actually retain muted recollections. So that's what I want to do today. I'd like to spend my time explaining how the pandemic of 1918, a classic case of social forgetting, actually happened. So I'll start by talking about how the pandemic was rewritten into a story that was a tale of resilience and triumph, and a story that failed to acknowledge the traumas of or to take lessons from the experiences of the Americans. Then second, I'll turn to how the pandemic was routinely hidden behind other narratives, often that of World War I, but not exclusively. But certainly the war as a useful narrative is no coincidence because it told the kind of story of progress that Americans liked to see for themselves. So how did this all work? Literally, how does social forgetting happen? The most visible practice is simply rewriting or retelling the story so that the chaos and the death of the epidemic experience was recast into a tale of resilience and triumph. Americans turned away from the realities of what had taken place and spoke only of those episodes, those parts of it that allowed a story of progress and success, leaving losses, dislocations, and mistakes largely unspoken. Certainly, the media played a central role in how this process unfolded. Americans had suffered terribly during the pandemic, and the stories of its devastation in lives taken, families shattered, communities unsettled, an economy disrupted, appeared in the pages of the press. They got a great deal of meaningful attention, especially in the second and third waves in the fall of 1918 and the spring of 1919. Newspapers detailed the expansive reach of the disease across the nation and the globe. They worried about its capacity to kill those in the prime of life. They covered data on the precise costs of the pandemic in both human and economic terms, and they returned frequently to their concern about a renewed wave and how the nation would learn to prevent the disease. But before long, the narrative of catastrophe and loss and the stock taking that it represented was joined by accounts of the country's rapid recovery. An example from the New York Times makes this really vivid, I hope. So the New York Times has a thing called New York's 100 Neediest Cases. It's actually something it continues to do today. It's a fundraiser over the winter holidays that raises money for what they termed in those days the most destitute families. And the stories from December 1918 or were really harrowing accounts of how terrible the situation was. But when they returned 6 months later, they told the same stories through a much more optimistic lens that seemed almost buoyant. Let me give you an example. Case 95. In December, they described a young man whose life had been a hard battle, who'd been overworked through the years of his youth and early manhood and had proven unable to, quote, withstand the influenza epidemic. Sick with flu and then pneumonia, he had to leave his wife and baby, and he had nowhere for them to turn for food or shelter while he was hospitalized. 6 months later, they returned to case 95, and the paper celebrates the success. This is a happy and healthy family today, they concluded exultantly. No more references to the hard lives of the poor, no reference to the fact that people who were poor had no resource to fall back on. Instead, an optimistic narrative about how much the country had been able to do takes the front page. Stories of the pandemic's ravages were balanced across the New York Times, it turns out, in upbeat stories, not just about these particular cases, but about the reopening of businesses, the reopening of schools, of people getting back to their jobs, and of Americans returning to good health. And it wasn't just the New York Times. As you look across media from this time period, you can see lots of accounts of the nation's resilience and its ultimate recovery and success. The threat of the pandemic itself, of influenza, even becomes something that's seen as quite manageable. By the autumn of 1919, for instance, Literary Digest talked about the fear of a returning wave, but went on to say that we'll be fighting an old foe with many of whose tricks we're now familiar, and this should give us a certain advantage in the contest. Instead of a deep consideration of what had happened, thoughtful preparation for what was surely to come, what the country could learn from what it had just been through, instead, American media embraced tales of success and tales of a forward-looking and optimistic, progressing country. Interestingly, for me, this kind of narrative also turned up among healthcare professionals. When they first emerged, well, during the crisis and after they first emerged from it, healthcare professionals frequently talked about a very costly and painful experience. What's remarkable is how quickly those narratives were replaced, publicly at least, by discussions in which the pandemic became just a prelude to greater successes and opportunities. So, for instance, among public health officials, disease prevention had been their primary goal during the pandemic, and during it, they were forced to acknowledge that they weren't able to stop the flu. And in fact, they weren't clear in their own minds of whether or not they'd been able to limit the scale of the pandemic. But as the crisis receded, fairly quickly, public health authorities began to talk about what was ahead and the ways in which only opportunity was in front of them. I'll give you another really specific example to show you what I mean, this time from Mazik P. Ravenel, who was a professor of preventative medicine at the University of Missouri and a really important leader in the field. In October 1919, he reviewed the profession's work among American soldiers in a lecture and admitted to what he viewed as public health's uneven record, suggesting, "We must confess that on the whole, we made a dismal failure in our attempts to control the spread of influenza." But 2 years later, he returns to the subject and gives us a completely different account. At this point, he's actually the president of the American Public Health Association and really at the pinnacle of his profession. And this time, though he acknowledges the challenges that public health faces, his emphasis is in an entirely different place. He says, "We were born at an opportune moment, have lived in a period for which for all time will be remarkable for its scientific achievement." And he concludes that we cannot, if we would stand still and point to our past achievements, we cannot, if we would stand still and point to our past achievements, noblesse oblige. In other words, we must go forward with all that we have to offer. He remembered the epidemic, but he chose not to focus on it, or to lament it, or even to review it closely, but instead looked confidently to the future. It's physicians whose narratives seem darkest during and after the pandemic. Victor Vaughan proves a really good example here. He was a distinguished leader of American medicine. He served the Army as the head of infectious disease, communicable disease during the pandemic. And in 1926, when he wrote his memoir, he basically said, "I'm not going into the history of the influenza epidemic." He wanted nothing to do with it. Despite the disclaimer, though, he did, in fact, return to that story. It was haunting him. He described that in the morning, the bodies are stacked about the morgue like cordwood. This picture was painted on my memory cells at the Division Hospital in 1918, when deadly influenza demonstrated the inferiority of human inventions in the destruction of human life. He professed to want to forget, but it was clear that his professional identity had really been shaken. While his private trauma remained, oops, sorry there. I'm going the wrong way. Give me a sec here. There we go. Though his private trauma remained, what we find is in the public sphere, this sort of self-critical, introspective gaze of evaluating what had taken place during the pandemic disappeared, and relatively quickly. Even before the epidemic had run its full course, physicians began to call for research, appropriately enough, into every aspect of influenza's secrets, promising their work could in the future protect Americans. As influenza continued to threaten people, particularly in 1920 and 22, physicians continued to view those as opportunities, presenting scientists with a chance to test hypotheses. And though a small group of scientists would continue that work and actually dedicate themselves to research into influenza, by 1924, the broader interest had almost disappeared. The subject index, for instance, of the Journal of the American Medical Association that year included only 14 entries focused on influenza, which is a stunning contrast to pages and pages and pages of references just a few years earlier. I don't think it's any coincidence that this sort of optimism of the medical field that becomes really vivid by the mid-20s is probably connected in a sense to the fact that influenza is not so much in the conversation. It's worth noting that Congress did play a role in this tendency away from conversation on and focus on the pandemic. In October of 1918, Congress had in fact provided $1 million of emergency funds for research on influenza. But when the flu passed and we moved into the aftermath, they tightened their purse strings pretty tightly. In early 1919, many politicians suggested the need for federal funding for research in influenza. And the vice president actually offered a resolution from the state of Ohio calling for $5 million of federal funds. Other states followed suit, urging that the federal government step in and fund some research. And in 1920, the Senate took up serious consideration of this. But they started at $1 million, not $5. And as the conversations persisted, it dropped to $500,000, then to $250,000. And in the end, the Congress gave no money for flu research. Some people feared the encroachment of the federal government, far more because they didn't trust the public health service to use the money wisely. In either case, Congress ignored the fact that they had an opportunity to do some exploration. Public health leaders had said they chose not to do so. This instance of social forgetting, this tendency to want to forget by way of simply ignoring, is kind of the second thing I want to detail. This practice of sort of looking past the pandemic was vividly evident even as the pandemic was ongoing, as the military conflict trumped sort of the public attention to the pandemic. Always it seemed to have to compete in a sense with the war. In a glaring example that's now pretty familiar to folks, it's been in the press a great deal, the city of Philadelphia was hit with flu, but decided to go forward with its Fourth Liberty Loan Drive's kickoff parade. 1/5 of the city's population shows up, and this helps present a terrible ravaging of the city with influenza. The war had simply come first. And that's true in much of the media actually during the pandemic, except during the worst of a local incursion, influenza would be below the fold or in the back pages of local newspapers. And the president. Wilson failed to halt troop shipments to Europe, which encouraged the spread of disease around the United States as soldiers moved to points of embarkation. It also made the work of fighting harder because 30,000 soldiers died in American training camps and another almost 16,000 died in France. Fearing Americans might get distracted by the pandemic, Wilson also chose never to speak publicly of the pandemic. Even at a moment when 25 million Americans were sickened and more than 500,000 died, he offered no words of guidance, no words of sympathy. He simply pretended it wasn't happening. And the silence was replicated on military gravestones of the 45,000 soldiers who died of influenza. Their name, their religion, their rank, their service designation, their home state, the date of death is all there, but not the flu. Similarly, and interestingly to me, the US Army's accounting also failed to separate out the flu deaths from those that took place on the battlefield. The deaths were remembered, but the epidemic simply wasn't. Other public memorials to the war's dead did much the same. For one example, at the University of Virginia, they included a dedicated page for those who died in the war, and they included influenza pandemic victims on that page, I think in an attempt to suggest that the sacrifices were in a sense equivalent, that those who'd stepped up to serve, whether they died of flu or died on the fields of France, were equally worthy of recognition. However, by coupling those two things together, it began to sort of veil the pandemic's importance. And that obscuring was far more complete at the University of Montana. Here they planted 32 yellow pines to celebrate those who had died as soldiers in the war. But neither the large plaque naming all the names nor the individual plaques mentioned the cause of death. Though according to the university, a majority of the casualties had actually died of influenza in Missoula or at local training camps, not in combat. And again, the intention here, I think, was to honor those who had served, certainly a useful and an honorable effort. The problem is that what that does is that we cannot see the pandemic. It becomes obscured in a sense. And this practice of veiling the pandemic behind tributes to the war casualties turned up in other places. As one example, in one of the few paintings by an American to reference the Spanish flu, the interior of a hospital tent here by John Singer Sargent, we find that he has included the flu, but only if you have the insider's eye that can identify it. In that row of cots, it turns out that the red covering over the quilts on some beds represent those with contagious cases of flu. The brown covering meant it was either non-influenza or a convalescing case. Like the gravestones, this painting remembers the epidemic and its victims, but doesn't announce their presence except to the rare insider, who knew enough to recognize what was being intimated, even as it was hidden to a much clearer, behind much clearer references to the war. If traces to the pandemic sometimes turned up, what's really noteworthy is how rarely sort of pop culture references turned up. I mentioned the one blues song, and in fact, it was in the blues, not coincidentally, that accounts of the flu sometimes turned up. But we need to remember first that this was music that was quite marginalized in the white mainstream. And it's also, even in the blues, that we find only a small number of tunes. In fact, popular music, ignored the pandemic almost altogether. In fact, it was only in American literature that we sort of get at any attempt at a fulsome coverage of the pandemic. But even here, authors' choices often hid the flu, and there's still a surprisingly sparse number of accounts. Willa Cather includes the flu in her novel, One of Ours, but it's really lost in a much larger book about the war, though in fact, it's a really gripping account of what flu did. Thomas Wolfe recounted his own sort of autobiographical experience in a semi-autobiographical novel, Look Homeward, Angel. And here, Wolfe, or the main character, in this case, Eugene, is called home from college to the deathbed of his brother. And Wolfe really does an amazing job, I think, of capturing the kind of horror of this illness and death. This was a terrible disease to die from. He does it in graphic detail, describing how the main character, Eugene, is choked by the ugliness and discomfort of death, how messy the death is, how he could never again escape from the smothering flood of pain and ugliness. It's extraordinarily powerful in its evocation of the sick room and the deathbed. But the horror of influenza is easily matched by the horror of the family's dysfunction, which, except for a couple of pages, is really the center of the chapter. In the story, the mother collapses into recognition of the tragedy because her son's death makes impossible the repair of the family's broken relationships. Eugene comforts her, but acknowledges that it was not and could never be all right. But what they're lamenting is the broken relationship and the fact that they can now not repair it. The epidemic is there, but it's secondary to the family's problems, to their relational trauma, and the entire episode is a few pages in a massive tome. Similarly, in Images of a Catholic Girlhood, Mary McCarthy recounts her story, in this case, in a single paragraph of her memoir. Her story is one of being orphaned as influenza kills both of her parents. Hers is really interesting though only a paragraph, because she recounts not only how it felt for her, but also the way social forgetting was already underway. She wrote, "Our father had put us beyond the pale by dying suddenly of influenza and taking our young mother with him. A defection that was remarked on with horror and grief, commingled as though our mother had been a pretty secretary with whom he had wantonly absconded into the irresponsible paradise of the hereafter." McCarthy illuminated both the sense of loss and abandonment that she experienced, but also the unease of her community with accepting the reality of the costs of the pandemic. It's Catherine Ann Porter's novel, which, if you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, that's best known of the accounts written about the pandemic, and for good reason. It is the best account and the one that most effectively challenged social forgetting. And as a result, I think here we can see the trauma that was taking place, as Guy Biner would describe, behind the scenes. Porter grounds her entire novel in the story of the pandemic. In the early pages, her main character, again semi-autobiographical, Miranda, a young journalist, is sort of second to the story of the war, but relatively quickly as she becomes ill, the flu and what it means to the community takes center stage. We get detail on what it was like to suffer from influenza. We get led into the sort of the fever, the delirium, and the pain that influenza sufferers go through. Miranda in the story is frightened of the oblivion and death, but then invited by it, and ultimately seeks death, but it's not hers. She doesn't die, but is brought back to life in a sense against her will by the medical caregivers that surround her. And she sees, she says, with a new anguish, the dual world to which she was now condemned. She explores the patient's grappling with coming back to life, and in a sense recounts the depression that was really common for many influenza sufferers. She also illuminates the pressures toward forgetting that she immediately experienced. As she struggles with her, quote, lost rapture of her glimpse at death, she confronts the unwavering assumption that she must be glad to be alive. She writes, "It will not do to betray the conspiracy and tamper with the courage of the living. There's nothing better than to be alive. Everyone agrees on that. It is past argument, and who attempts to deny it is justly outlawed." Having awakened in real life, actually, to her lover's death from influenza, Miranda is all the more tortured and struggles to imagine her own coming back to life. Her thoughts close the novel and leave the reader deep in her despair as she muses, "No more war, no more plague, only the day's silence that follows the ceasing of the heavy guns, noiseless houses with the shades drawn, empty streets, the dead cold light of tomorrow." Porter recalls the epidemic vividly for her reader and also acknowledges for us the power of the broader culture to demand its erasure, to move on as if nothing had ever happened, though she certainly knew that something terrible had happened. So, the influenza epidemic of 19, an event that ravaged the United States as it did, in fact, the rest of the globe, that demonstrated the limits of modern science and American know-how, that caused extraordinary suffering and grief, was not something Americans wanted to remember. It simply didn't fit with the national narrative of exceptionalism and triumph that was very much at the center of the nation's preferred storyline. Americans chose instead to leave the history of the suffering aside, to rewrite it as a tale of triumph, to obscure it behind the more glorious story of the First World War, or to simply turn their back on it altogether. I want to conclude by saying that I find this deeply problematic, and I'm going to talk about just two reasons. The first is the reality that social forgetting took place even as millions of people suffered. Research suggests that for those who have suffered through trauma, that the ability to tell one's story, to share one's narrative, is a fundamental requirement of recovery, offering the possibility not of returning to normal life, so to speak, but of integrating one's experiences so that one's life and all of its parts are integrated and whole. One personal example, my grandfather's the young man on the far right in this photograph. He lost both of his parents, Elizabeth and John, in a 5-day span at the end of February 1920. He went from being a child to an adult and to an orphan over the course of a couple days. I knew him very well when I was his age, as he is in this picture, and he never spoke of influenza. His story had been essentially silenced by the culture. As we know by this research of trauma, for survivors of the epidemic then, struggling through lives that were remade by grief and loss, they confronted a culture that didn't want to hear about it, who preferred the popular and upbeat narratives that simply trumped their painful rendition of the pandemic. And as optimism suppressed the voices of trauma, those Americans were left to continue to suffer in silence. Their suffering likely deepened by our silence and our forgetting. The second problem I see is that if we turn our back on the pandemics, as we are, of course, deciding about right now, it doesn't allow us to reckon with the realities of what's taken place. And this has a second consequence, that we don't act on the lessons that are right in front of us. And I'm going to mention just 3 from 1918 that I think are relevant. The first is pandemics arrive unexpectedly and don't respect national or state borders. We need expansive preparation, and we need good coordination among the states in the case of the US in the midst of a crisis. In the aftermath of 1918, however, we didn't prepare for the future, and we know that we faced COVID-19 quite unprepared in some ways, and certainly without much cooperation or coordination across jurisdictions. Second, people really want and need honest and clear communication from experts in the midst of a pandemic. Politicizing a pandemic totally interferes with this, and we saw it in both 1918 and 2020. This is not to say that there weren't people like Dr. Jetelina who worked really, really hard to get truth out to us and to do so in a really clear manner. But unfortunately, they were up against forces that were corrupting and mixing up, in a sense, and even mistelling or misrepresenting the story. And then third, epidemic disease, like other health conditions, hit the poor and communities of color the hardest in 1918. The social safety net is better now, but it's still clear that in 2020, particularly in the first 6 months of the pandemic, but still even today, that we have inequitable healthcare and access to it, as well as inadequate access to things that are absolutely essential, like food and housing. We did not improve that, and the pandemic of 2020 have shown us that we have a terrible problem if we didn't already know it. Now we're in that moment. We can remember or we can forget. We can learn or we can turn our back on the education we've been offered through COVID-19. This seminar and all of you working on rituals in the making constitute a clear rebuttal to what I see as already proving to be the really powerful urge to forget. And for that, I thank you and for this opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bristow. We really appreciate you coming out to talk to us about the social context and historical context of the 1918 influenza pandemic. I think we can see a lot of similarities between then and now, with the COVID-19 pandemic also being heavily politicized. So I will now turn to Dr. Jetelina. Dr. Jetelina is an epidemiologist and scientific consultant for various organizations such as the CDC and the White House. She also runs a blog known as Your Local Epidemiologist that focuses on educating the public on health matters such as COVID, vaccines, and other public health issues. I will now spotlight her for everyone. All right, welcome. I hand it over to you, Dr. Jetelina.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I don't know how I'm supposed to follow up Dr. Bristow's lecture. I learned so much. I wish I knew all of that before everything hit the fan here in the United States. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, how do I... Oops. Okay. I am just going to assume you guys can see this, but thank you for having me. My name is Katelyn Jetelina. I'm an epidemiologist that kind of stumbled into this world of scientific communication. Early in the pandemic, I was watching very closely the numbers in China, then hit Iran, and then hit Italy. And in March of 2020, realized a lot of people were had a lot of questions, including a lot of the loved ones I had close to me. And so I started just an email walking people through on a daily basis what was going on, what I was seeing in the data. And that grew and grew to the newsletter that I now have called Your Local Epidemiologist. It's reached 330 million people in 166 countries. So it's been a wild ride. And I will kind of walk you through what I expected and then kind of what I did not expect with my epidemiologist hat on as we went through this pandemic. But, uh-oh, why isn't this going? Okay. In epidemiology, and particularly in flu epidemiology or infectious diseases, we're taught that there's very distinct phases of a pandemic. This is a WHO graph that we all kind of learn about, but as in our training, and this was made before the COVID-19 pandemic. And phases are often defined as the global average of cases over time. Based on continued risk assessment. So you can see that cases are kind of the y-axis, time is the x-axis. And so we go quite a long time between pandemics in which there's really no cases. Then we have this alert phase, right? We find out that there is undiagnosed pneumonia in China. And then we go through the emergency or pandemic phase with a response. And then after this pandemic phase that takes quite a lot of time, we start going into this transition phase of cases, which means that we're between a full-on emergency and an endemic, which means that it's predictable. And I would argue right now we're in this active transition phase between a pandemic and an endemic. That means there's still some surprises, there's still some unpredictability. The patterns haven't really solidified, the epidemiological patterns, but it is starting to move forward to be a whole lot more manageable than it was at the height of the emergency. Our human response is kind of at the bottom, our public health response, and that in between pandemics, we should be preparing. Then we go into a response phase, and then we go into this recovery phase. And this recovery phase is detailing lessons learned. What did we get right? What are lessons from the pandemic to be better and smarter next time? What did we get wrong? And how are we going to do better in the future? These are critical in understanding these lessons learned. And not only learning these lessons, but also a time of reflection and, quite frankly, a time to heal from collective trauma. I think a lot of us in public health just haven't had the time to process what we all just went through the past 3 years. And I'm afraid that the public also hasn't time to heal from this trauma because it was incredibly disruptive, and a lot of lives, over 1 million people died during this short 3 years. And so I, as an epidemiologist, as the first pandemic I've lived through, I was expecting this transition phase. I was expecting a phase of reflection and lessons learned and the need to heal from trauma. What I have been surprised about, and honestly what I wasn't expecting as an epidemiologist, is this thing that I call the new phase of the pandemic is revisionism, which is, there's lots of definitions of revisionism, but one I pulled was this critical reexamination, turning into the retelling of a story with substantial altercations of the environment we are experiencing. So, for example, the Great Barrington Declaration was right, is one very interesting revisionism that is getting louder and louder over time. For those of you guys don't know, the Great Barrington Declaration was proposed in October of 2020 by a small group of scientists. So October 2020, remember, was before vaccines were even available. And this advocated for a distinct approach: isolate the vulnerable while allowing infections to spread among the lower risk members of a population. They claimed that it would achieve herd immunity without the economic and social toll of lockdowns. Now, unfortunately, the authors didn't include any scientific evidence or models, and it was never peer reviewed, but the idea did go viral. And public health pushed back viciously against this idea at the time, given epidemiological, given logistical, and given ethical concerns about letting a virus spread uncontrollably in the United States in October of 2020 before vaccines. Now, that was kind of put to rest until just recently, a couple months ago, I think it's last year now, where two of the authors were invited of the Great Barrington Declaration were invited to testify to Congress. And after their testimony, one congresswoman said that history is proving them to be right. But they're not right. This committee would have benefited greatly from looking into the scientific evidence against the Great Barrington Declaration and why ultimately public health dismissed this idea. This is just one example of what we're seeing revisionism play out actively as we continue to reflect on the past 3 years. Another example is that COVID-19 was like the flu. There was this constant debate that COVID-19 is just like the flu throughout the pandemic, but we just knew this wasn't the case from looking at epidemiological data. This was the first data from China from January to February of 2020. So even before it started taking off in the United States, and the case fatality rate was about 17% across China, which means that about 17 out of 100 people that were infected or had a case were dying from COVID-19. It was even greater in the center of the outbreak in Wuhan, which is in blue, which was about 20% case fatality rate. But you can see that case fatality rate changes over time. It's different in different places. By February 1st, this case fatality rate in Wuhan was about 6%, while it was about 0.7% across China. And this isn't far off from, for example, SARS or MERS, which has a high case fatality rate of about 10 to 34%. As a comparison at the time, the US seasonal flu has a case fatality rate of approximately 0.1%. But again, over time, the context changes. Context changes in time, in a particular population, and in context. And over time, our case fatality rate kept declining, kept declining, kept declining, and kept getting closer and closer to the flu because of immunity. Currently, COVID-19 is still about 4 times deadlier than the flu, but it is starting to decrease. And we need a nuanced and honest discussion about how this has changed over time. And we cannot forget what the beginning really looked like. Another example of revisionism is that I'm hearing all the time is that we either overreacted or we underreacted. And still to this day, we have a lot of this tug of war between the two camps. And another is just that I think, false idea that we made poor decisions based on the science. All of these revisionism statements, though, are missing trade-offs, honest and nuanced trade-offs that we had to make at the time. Some are completely ignoring numbers, and some are failing to recognize that hindsight is 2020. It's really hard to remember how little we knew as scientists back in March of 2020 about COVID-19. And so I think that the definition of revisionism compared to, for example, the very much lessons learned, the very much reflection needed, is that recognizing that epidemiological, ethical, and logistical details just cannot be left out of our memories when we do make these reflections. My biggest concern is losing sight about how traumatic this was for our society on so many levels, right? Disruption, many people lost businesses. There was a lot of scrambling in the beginning, a lot of stress. There's still a lot of anxiety among groups. But the lowest hanging fruit I don't want us to forget is the death rates, that this was not just some small event that we experienced, particularly in the United States. This top graph shows respiratory infection death rates over time, and we just see this massive uptick in the United States, as well as other countries like Brazil in 2020 and 2021. So much so that this impacted our life expectancy, not as much as I just heard from 1918, but we did have a dramatic drop in the United States, which is this green line especially when we compare it to other countries, high-income countries like in Europe. Something was definitely going on in the United States compared to our peer countries. So this was just not some small event. And we can see it in the data, but what I've learned in public health is that the most compelling evidence is when we combine qualitative data with quantitative data. Qualitative meaning stories or memories with these numbers. And, you know, one of the most distinct memories I have is of the Red Cross boat floating by in New York in March of 2020 because hospitals were being overwhelmed and our morgues just didn't have room anymore. And so I really hope that we can learn from both of these data sources. So like I said, one of my biggest surprises as an epidemiologist, I admit, is that the extent of revisionism we're experiencing right now, how we're actively watching history being written. And truly the extent in which people want to rewrite history to make themselves look correct too. And because I've been so surprised about this, I've been talking to a lot of psychologists. Dr. Ben Rosenberg in California has been a fantastic confidant for myself in understanding why do we forget after catastrophic events, and not just the pandemic, but also mass shootings or other hurricanes or natural or unnatural disasters. And what he's taught me is that, you know, this is actually a very natural human response. Unfortunately, as time passes by, we don't do a great job at recalling events. Humans, and because of that, we're not good at integrating those events into our lives or using those experiences to make future decisions or judgments. Simply put, humans forget. Psychologists know how, right? Through neurons, through our brain, through synapses, but they don't really know why. But there's two hypotheses of why we think humans forget. One is infodemic, right? We're just simply inundated with just too much information to retain it all. And this information overload is at least partially responsible for our forgetfulness. Two is biases. To wade through all of this information, we use shortcuts. And these are mostly good and effective. In fact, it's been one of the reasons humans have survived. We've evolved to have these shortcuts. And like I said, they're mostly good, but the human brain's not a computer. It's not just data in, data out. The way we think about things is not purely logical. Biases and mental shortcuts have a large effect on our memories. And there's a lot of biases. There's four, though, that really ring true to the pandemic. One is called immune neglect. And just like our body's physical immune system helps us keep healthy, we also have an emotional immune system that keeps us resilient. And on balance, this is a good thing, right? It allows us to bounce back from really difficult situations very quickly. That fear, that outrage, those negative emotions that big events arouse often don't last that long, which then impacts our judgment and decision making in the future. The second bias that I've learned is the availability or recency bias. When we make decisions, we don't weigh the pros and cons equally. Some things count more than others for individuals, and these things regularly come to mind will sway us more, regardless of their actual importance or value.
This is the type of weather that Katelyn could get me to go out in.
Uh-oh. I think I hear someone. If they could just
my friend. I don't have a best friend.
Uh-oh. Paige,
Sorry about that. Yep, that's finished.
Okay.
Please continue.
The third bias is called hindsight bias. Basically, I knew it all along, right? Humans tend to overestimate their ability to predict what in reality was an unpredictable event. And this can affect our memory and decision making. And then finally is cognitive dissonance, right? Early 2020 was horrible and things are much better now. This reconsideration of a big past event, like that sucked, but now things are good, can really feel off-putting or inconsistent. And so we humans really want to resolve that inconsistency. So people may discount how bad things were then and instead focus on how good things are now. And as an epidemiologist, right, I want to see the data behind this. I thought Dr. Rosenberg, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, but is this actually what we're seeing happen with this pandemic? And this evidence is actually starting to come out. Last year, Nature published an analysis using 4 studies across 11 countries. So there's about 11,000 people. And they surveyed people at the same time at 2 different time points of this pandemic on risk. They asked about trust in science. They asked whether they were vaccinated, and they asked a whole lot of other questions. And then they surveyed them again in 2023. And what they found, and in 2023, they asked people to recall what they answered in 2020, right? Recall those risk perceptions, recall that trust in science. What was really interesting was that both vaccinated and unvaccinated respondents remembered their 2020 or 2020 responses inaccurately, but in opposite directions. The more strongly respondents identified with their vaccination status, the greater distortion in their recall. So, for example, those vaccinated overestimated their risk perceptions in 2020, while those unvaccinated underestimated their risk perceptions and trust in science in 2020. Then what I found very interesting too was then the scientists gave a subset initiatives to recall, right? If we give you money or if we give you information on common errors of recall, how does that impact recall? And interestingly, it didn't. Money, small amounts of money and information about common errors of recall didn't impact their recall risk. What did impact it was, though, high incentives. The gap between the 2 groups was partially reduced when they got high incentives. So what this shows us is it follows that diverging representations of the past will and might impede effective future action. And I hope that we continue to see more and more studies out there about this, because I think it'll help us learn going forward, not just with COVID, but other diseases. And I'll get into that in a second. So to me, the biggest question is, what does this all mean, right? We're experiencing this currently. What does this all mean when I'm trying to self-reflect on the pandemic and get frustrated about other people's memories? What helps me is to remember that, 1, memories don't look the same for everyone. Sometimes the event doesn't even become a memory at all for some people. Humans have evolved to use these mental shortcuts to more smoothly navigate the world. Interestingly, number 2, which this past study showed, was that identity and motivation influence the direction in which we recall the past. That means the past is distorted for almost everyone, especially those that feel very strongly about behaviors that were made during the pandemic. Unfortunately, this together means that events get normalized, like a pandemic, like mass shootings, which will ultimately hurt us in the end, leading to a lack of pandemic preparedness or insufficient pushes for gun reform, for example. And this can lead to the never-ending cycle of panic and neglect that us in public health are so sick of experiencing, unless, though, we actively fight against it. And so there are things that we can do. For one, research indicates that just simple awareness of the biases that we currently have reduce their influence on us. Just being aware. In other words, we can help short circuit them by just simply shining light on and recognizing our own biases when we understand and remember the past couple of years. Something I'm trying to do more of, which is incredibly challenging, is to have discussions with people I disagree with. It's been not on Twitter, but face-to-face or on Zoom. It's been incredibly healing for me in understanding where people are coming from and the increasing loss of trust in public health and science. And 3 is what else I think we can do and need to do is to continue to educate to avoid collective amnesia. We need to make public health visible for the 21st century. We in public health have a saying that if public health works, it's invisible. The challenge is, though, that because of that, there's just collective amnesia about the 1918 flu pandemic, or even more recently, what we're seeing with measles, right? 3 days ago, there was an alarming report showing a 45-fold rise in measles in Europe. We've had already about 6 outbreaks in the United States with measles, and it's only been, 3-4 weeks into the year. And so I think we really need to educate, right? If there's collective amnesia, let's fix it. As generations age, these memories of these mid-20th century diseases fade. I think this is a blessing and it's a curse. And I think it's understandable. The onus is on educators, on public health, that we need to equip trusted messengers. The other 2 things I think are really playing into this, especially today, although I want to hear if it impacted 1918 as well, is this rise of individualism in the United States. One of the biggest challenges is that this individualism goes against public health DNA, a collective response for the good of the population. And to me, I think we desperately need to engage with people who find individualism increasingly important and develop interventions with them and not to them. And the third is there is a very scary decline in trust on an institutional level, but I'm very focused on public health and on science. I think I know mistakes were made during the pandemic. Also, misinformation is supercharged by social media, and there's also just bad actors driving the majority of, for example, anti-vax content. And so I think a lot of people need to work with these challenges and find solutions for them really quickly. So all of this kind of goes into reimagining public health and what we think as a society of public health for the 21st century. So I think I'm all out of time. I'm right at the top of the hour, but I really look forward to your questions and further discussion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Jetelina. I've definitely learned a lot, especially I love you bringing up the psychological biases that impact our remembering of catastrophic events. I think that's really important and like understanding how this happens and the process of it happening. So before we begin our Q&A session, I would like to ask Martha Greenwald to speak about our next event coming up. Uh, Martha, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you. I want everyone to thank Paige first for her inspired juxtaposition in asking Dr. Bristow and Dr. Jetelina to speak today. This was a very necessary and enlightening conversation, and this pairing was Paige's idea. Quickly, before the Q&A, I've just been asked to tell you about 3 events that are coming up in the first week of March that continue and expand the work of Rituals in the Making. On March 5th, we'll hear on a webinar from historian Scott Gabriel Knowles. He's the creator and host of the podcast COVID Calls, interviewing guests from across the globe on COVID research, issues, and culture, which he sustained for an epic 500+ episodes. And Professor Knowles' work itself became a ritual of the pandemic. On March 6th, we'll have a joint book event with Nicholas Montemurano and myself, titled Against Forgetting, Bearing Witness Through Pandemic Narratives. Nicholas is the author of If There Are Any Heavens and a memoir in verse about the death of his mother from COVID. I'll be speaking about the Who We Lost Project, focusing on Who We Lost, a portable COVID memorial, an anthology I curated and edited that was published last spring. We're honored to say that Dr. Anthony Fauci will be introducing this event and offering remarks. On March 7th, we'll gather with artist Suzanne Furstenberg to showcase the copious work that Rituals in the Making has done with the In America Remember project, including a demo of the curation and transcription process, which is a vital part of the post-deinstallation work that they have done here. And more details and other things related to these three events will be forthcoming shortly. We hope to see you in March. And now it is time for your questions. Please put them in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much, Martha, for the announcement. We're definitely looking forward to March. So to first kind of kick off our Q&A session, I have a question from one of our fellow research assistants, Hamid. She asks, could COVID eventually join the categorization of, quote, America's forgotten pandemic, end quote, similar to how the 1918 influenza was? Or do you think the presence of social media and technology and the internet, and how that lasts forever prevents this classification? Um, Dr. Jetelina, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to, although I want to hear Dr. Bristow's opinion. I think that um that's a really interesting point of view of how things live on the internet right now. And I honestly didn't think of that before. I've always been concerned about the opposite of social media hypercharging this idea of revisionism, given a few things, given that false facts spread 6 times faster than the true facts. And emotion really drives things going viral instead of nuanced, steady, boring thinking. So I've always been, so I don't know. I mean, I think it'll be interesting to show how those two kind of play out going forward and which one kind of wins the race. So I guess my answer is I don't know, but I would love to hear Dr. Bristow's.
Well, and the great thing is historians, we're not in the business of prediction. It's one of the things we can always beg off questions by saying, I'm sorry, I do the past, not the future. But I think it's a great question. And this is a place where I have some optimism, though for me, it is also not about the social media element of it. What I noticed with the pandemic was that immediately, even as early as the summer of 2020, archives all over the country, local historical societies were collecting stories, right? We've got people on the screen today. Martha Greenwald's been doing this work. Michelle Fishburne is here. She's traveled thousands of miles around the country collecting stories. She's on the call today. StoryCorps has been collecting, is in the process. My local historical society on Vashon Island, we were doing interviews of people coming and going from the grocery store until the spike came again in a couple of months later. I feel like people were attending more to the collection of stories this time in a way that people simply didn't in 1918. We're a different society. We live in public in a different kind of way. We're much more self-revealing than people were in 1918. And my hope is that will serve us well, because I think we do have, and there's a wonderful question about how do we make sure our stories are remembered. I think there are many, many opportunities to do so in most communities. Search on the internet and you'll find a memory collection that's being built. And that gives me hope that this won't become a forgotten pandemic, and that might give us an opportunity not only to remember it for the reason that I began with about supporting the people around us who have suffered great losses, but could that also then lead to an ability to do something about things like preparation? That I'm less hopeful about, because it is so politicized for, exactly the way Dr. Jetelina was just describing. So I don't know either, but I'm hoping that we will retain more of the personal memories in a way that we lost them last time. And that can be really healthy for us on the level of the family, on the level of our faith communities, on the level of our academic institutions and educational institutions. I hope we can be more caring for those around us in the years to come than I think we were in 1918.
Yeah, I think those are good responses. We fortunately don't have future sight, but I think, seeing what groups now are working towards preservation of memory and of loss for now. I think Edward Koenig had a second question. How do we move others who have not been impacted to understand the importance of maintaining these remembrances, and perhaps even including their own? Dr. Jetelina, Dr. Bristow, any response?
I mean, I think what's worked with when we look at, for example, measles is stories. I mean, stories about how bad it was to these people. I think that there's a lot of empathy that comes from personalizing these experiences that data could never do. And that qualitative perspective is incredibly moving, and so I think it's exact kind of the last answer. It's collecting those stories, it's telling them, it's having discussions, it's all of the above.
And I think the most recent comment from Charanda, excuse me if I mispronounced it, Johnson, is a really important one, because it does feel like, I mean, I think the questions are really prescient one, because we're all feeling this sense that it is being forgotten. People do want to move on. And yes, we need to have lives for the very psychological reasons Dr. Jetelina talked about, right? We need to be able to live, but we shouldn't forget. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think the fact that people are wanting to raise the question is really healthy and really helpful. The fact that there are people on this call or on this presentation, it's really helpful. And I don't think these conversations were probably happening in 1918. So again, I don't know what will happen, but I do think we have to keep having that sort of substantial rebuttal to forgetting. We just can't let it happen. And in a sense, that falls on all of us, and the willingness to tell one story alongside the data. I mean, I agree. I think the qualitative plus quantitative is so important, because for some people, only the graph will speak. For others, only the personal story will speak. For others of us, we need them all. But continuing to tell the stories and for people to continue to commit to the research, I think is going to be crucial.
Thank you so much for answering the question. We have another comment from Kristen Urquiza. Can the speakers reflect on the efforts led by the COVID bereaved to establish a COVID Memorial Day and a permanent national COVID memorial, and how that differs from social movements coming out of other pandemics? For background, more than 200 cities and states recognize COVID Memorial Day, and there are bipartisan bills being considered in Congress.
I didn't know that was happening, so that makes me happy. You know, I think there was one event, I don't remember, maybe it was last year. It's all mungled up now, but where we put 1 million white flags on the mall in front of the National Mall, and it was incredibly moving, and it was a way to kind of see, and I think that people really want that. I mean, at 1.2 million people dying is not a small amount of thing, and I'm surprised of how little collective effort we have. So I'm really glad to hear that. I didn't know that was a movement being pushed forward at Congress.
And I didn't either. And the one caution, I think a couple of people have commented on this also, is that we have to continue to remember in the risk with memorials is a flattening of the experiences. So it comes to seem as if everyone's experience of the pandemic was the same, when in fact we know it was incredibly differentiated, especially by race and class. And that I'm completely in favor of any capacity to memorialize and to remember. I hope that those occasions can then become opportunities to remind ourselves of the differential experiences that were the case in 1918, and certainly were the case and continues to be the case even in 2024. But no, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about that movement either. So thank you for bringing that to our mind.
Yes, I can also send you some links afterwards to more about the COVID Memorial Day and these bipartisan bills. I also saw someone had their hand raised. Sharonda, was that you?
That was me. I have thoughts, questions, comments, and I'm not really sure if it's a question or how to phrase it. That's why I'm like, let me just raise my hand and say what I'm thinking in my head. So, Katelyn, you referred to the In America Remember Memorial, which I participated in myself. And as a result of that memorial, there are actually a number of those flags were placed at the Smithsonian American Museum of History, and they will remain there in perpetuity. So of course, like, there are permanent, memorials, markers that we know are sitting in time. Kristen mentioned, like, a number of states, my state in Delaware, we have a permanent COVID memorial that sits at public health. And I know other states have done similar things. I'm not sure from the historical context if that was happening in the past. But certainly, I mean, in our time, we talked about, like, it feels like there is this conscious effort to erase or forget what happened. So I think what I'm questioning is, like, what decides if this is forgotten or not, if that makes sense. Is it the consciousness of society? Is it the political resolve? Because we know this has been completely politicized and it's shaped the way people view this and respond to this? Or is it something else from a historical context that we're missing in this conversation?
It's all of the above. I mean, I think with 1918, I can say that there was no memorialization at all. There was very rarely someone would put a memorial in a local paper on the 1-year anniversary, which was really common with death at the time, but it was very little followed after the pandemic, I think, because it had been so dramatic for people. But there aren't memorials. I mean, I can't name, I have seen one memorial to the flu pandemic victims, and it's actually in South Africa. Is the only one I've ever seen. There are some of these sprinkled in among war memorials, but it simply was not memorialized in that kind of way where it is recognized as a public monument in a sense. So that I haven't seen. So the fact that that's happening now seems really useful. The collection of stories was not happening in 1918. In fact, people were discouraged from telling their stories. It wasn't appropriate in a sense. It was not the mood of the 20s. But I think government action is also really, really important. And in the 20s, again, we have an era of reduced government. The government which governs least governs best was sort of the ideology of the time. And so we don't take a serious accounting of what public health needed or could have had. Just doesn't happen in that period. While Canada, in the meantime, is creating a national health system in the wake of the pandemic, the United States does not. And that's where that notion of individualism that Dr. Jetelina raised is really important. So I don't know the answer. It's so hard to read the future, but all of the things that you named, Tronda, are right on the money, I think, and really, really important. And it's all in competition with those psychological reasons that push us to forget and the political reasons that are pushing the forgetting right now and pushing the revisionism. And that really scares me, because though in 1918 it was really politicized, it was much more about the war, and it wasn't a Democrat versus Republican thing at all. It was often, it might be Democrat Republican, but only in the infighting in a particular city council or a governor versus a city's mayor. It wasn't a nationwide politicization that we've seen with this. And that's the part that really works against my hopefulness sometimes, that and the fact that I understand the urge to forget because I experience it myself some days. Yes, and that's right. There is a memorial in Vermont, but it's relatively new, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was built on one of the anniversaries.
Dr. Jetelina, would you like to respond, or would you like me to ask another question?
No, I don't have anything else to respond. I thought, Chandra, I mean, everything that I'm kind of thinking about, I often get asked a question of, when do we know we're in an endemic? We don't know when we're in an endemic until it's happened, looking back. And so that's kind of how I viewed this, is it's actively happening, and where can I help that discussion, because we're defining it today as this collective society. I saw a comment in here about the lockdowns that I wanted to comment on, because this is a fantastic example of revisionism around the discussion on the lockdowns. And I think I have a lot of thoughts. One is that lockdowns, literally people being forced to stay in their home. One really never happened in the United States like other countries, but it really was, if it was happening, businesses shut. It was pretty short-lived, about 6 to 10 weeks in the United States. Now, I think it depends also how we define lockdowns, right? Some people are defining lockdowns as schools closed, and some schools were closed for far too long. Some are describing it as not being able to go to basketball games, right? And so I think that, again, this is an example of that we need nuance in our discussions on how do we define lockdown. I think what's also very interesting that we're seeing is that the idea of a lockdown and all the pushback is very different by country. So, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, there was pushback about the lockdowns, but maybe like 2 or 3 years into it. And even today, looking back, a lot of countries, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, very much appreciated the measures their government took. And so to me, this tells me that the policy isn't just determined by cases or numbers, but it's also very much determined by culture and morals and psychology of a collective group. And how we think about these things is so context dependent, that this conversation about lockdowns is very different in the United States and even within states than compared to other countries. And I hope that if you're ever in conversations about the damage of lockdowns, to really start picking apart, like, okay, like, what lockdown, like, how do you define lockdown? What are you defining as the outcome? And do you know that it was actually shorter than we remember, and it feels like it was a long time ago? The last thing I'll say about the lockdowns, which I'm very much looking forward to, is that some epidemiologists are starting to leverage AI to look at the length of lockdowns by county and by state and the impact it had. And so I hope that those are the types of answers we'll start getting in the years to come around policy and how we can actually do better and how we do better in what context and all the questions that arises. And that is one thing that AI, I think, can help us with, because it's a massive question to be answered. But thanks for bringing up that lockdown question in the chat.
And I'm just going to piggyback on that, because I think one of the things you said, it's so interesting that research is ongoing right now about the impact of different measures. That research on the impact of measures was largely done about 90 years after the flu pandemic, right? So that the moment when you could have done it, when you had a lot available, there was not the interest or the political will, or the scientific or historical interest, I guess. And there seems to be more of that today than we can see in the 1920s. So again, okay, I'm an optimist at heart, if you couldn't already tell. And so I keep hoping that perhaps with that data, that will really help us to be able, as we get a little further from the experience, maybe tensions and heatedness of conversation can cool enough for us to have the conversations together, so that we get away from what you described as sort of, you're either on that it was all bad or it was all good. Actually, let's take a nuanced look at it. Maybe we have an opportunity to do that in the years to come, and that data will surely help us.
I will say I hope it helps. I think that what's really challenging right now is it seems that people have already made up their minds about masks work, masks don't work. Vaccines are good, vaccines are bad. Lockdowns are bad, lockdowns are good. That I hope that as people can put on more empirical hats and let that data tell us what we need to learn. And unfortunately, sometimes that will mean that things that I did, helping the response in Texas, were wrong. But I hope that we can, and like you said, I think with time, it will be easier to swallow pride and to be self-reflective as well. So we'll see. We'll see how it all pans out.
Thank you so much for your answers. We do have another question, or question/comment. So, as a pharmacist, what scares me is the current movement in some religious and political circles to not vaccinate for childhood diseases such as polio and measles. Um, can one of the presenters comment on about like the question of vaccines and maybe how we can um, become more conscious about vaccines, how we can be more pro-vaccine, or what are your thoughts?
I don't know if I have a very optimistic view on this. And so maybe Dr. Bristow does, but I think that measles, this whole collective amnesia, in that people don't know what measles looks like. And they haven't seen a kid die at the hospital because of measles in a very long time. And that's a good thing, but it's also, it hurts us as well. And so people have questions, and I think it's okay to have, it is okay to have questions. They just need to find answers, evidence-based answers, in a way they can make evidence-based decisions and choices. And that's something I'm very concerned about. I think what's going to happen is people are just going to have to see for themselves, and we're going to see a resurgence of vaccine preventable diseases. And that's what will ultimately change behavior into action. I don't know if I have a more optimistic view on that.
And I would just sort of say ditto. I think historically we've found, as we're finding now, that people's minds are made up about things. Sometimes I think it's from a need to feel certainty. And it's easier to say, I'm not going to get a vaccine because then I will have something I can blame, though. It just gives you a kind of staunch position that's easier than trying to navigate what are the right things to do. I'm a little worried about too many vaccines in a given moment. There's some data that says this, some data that says that. I think of the issue with autism and childhood vaccines, and I think it's a way to make it explainable. When people want certainty, and uncertainty is really, really hard sometimes. That was my biggest revelation from the pandemic, is it's really hard not to understand or not to know. We didn't know what was coming next. And I think sometimes some of the really hardline positions on things like vaccines is related to wanting to feel like, well, here's a study, it says this, and I can hold on to that tightly. And that's reassuring to me in some way. The other thing is, I think we have to be really careful not to demean those that disagree with us. I'm a deep believer in vaccines. I come from a family of scientists. And so I grew up believing in sort of the importance of science. I know it's not infallible, and I think that's important to know. But I have to be really careful. I've learned this from colleagues who've done studies, that it's not helpful to dismiss people who disagree with you. It's much more useful to talk about why. And here's how I came to my ideas. I respect you as a person. Can we talk more about this? And it's really hard to do. It's just, and particularly in this given moment, I think it's very, very hard to do. And that's going to make people, in a sense, go to their corners all the more vehemently. And I have to fight that impulse myself always, because it comes naturally, as naturally to me as anyone else.
Okay, I think we do have time for one more question. Um, so there is also talk about the idea of the concept of individualism in the chat I see, and I know Dr. Jetelina, you brought that up as a question towards Dr. Bristow. If you would like, we can end on the note of American individualism and American exceptionalism in the context of looks like lockdowns or masks or just in pandemic in general.
I'll give a question. I mean, I think the thing I'm most curious about was, did we see this during the 1918 flu? Was this idea about the idea of a collective responsibility versus an individual responsibility, and how did that play out during the 1918 flu?
It's really interesting. In 1918, I think the key for 1918 is they knew so much less. They couldn't see a virus yet. They didn't have the technology for it. The scientific community believed there was something smaller than bacteria and that this was in fact an infectious disease. The vast majority of Americans believed in germ theory, but again, they couldn't find the virus. They couldn't know for certain. So they're very much having to put things in place with no evidence to suggest whether or not they help. So what we find is in the immediate imposition of social distancing, masking, quarantining, closing of businesses, scattering of hours, ventilation on public transportation, all the things that we also tried, that there's initially a great deal of agreement with it and a willingness to follow it. It's a moment when science is really in the ascendance and the trust in science is high, and people are anxious to have anything to try. Alongside that, it's also the midst of a war. And so for the first couple of months, wearing a mask, not going to school is sold to the American public as a war act. That's why I say the politicizing of 1918 initially works well for public health because they can bind up the fight against influenza with the fight for the war. But the war ends. And so also, it's not completely tied, but in part tied to that, in part tied to, wait, there's a second wave. You told me if I did this, this would go away, and now it's back. And I'm not going to mask this time. So, but when we get people aren't aware largely of the first wave, but so the second wave, for many communities, it's just a few weeks or a month later that they get the third wave. And at that point, people are much more resistant to the public health measures. And it often is framed in terms of liberty and of freedom. It's not politicized Republican Democrat, but very much the sort of individual freedom is at the center of those arguments, or the right to make a living. So businesses are often in the foreground of leading the cause to overturn closures, not masking as much, but especially closures. So we certainly see it. For me, that was one of the first parallels, was like, oh my gosh, here we are again. It's liberty and justice for all, but we're going to lean towards the liberty and away from, that the collective, which might have brought more justice in the midst of the pandemic. And I know we're almost out of time. Can I just say thank you so much to the folks who organized this, and especially also to Dr. Jetelina. This was such an honor and a privilege, and I've just learned so much from you today that is really helpful for me. And I encourage anybody on the call to sign up for the Your Local Epidemiologist, become one of those 330 million people who've had contact with that.
Yeah, thank you to our speakers again for coming out or coming virtually today to talk with us about this really important topic of just collective amnesia and ways to keep memories of loved ones lost to the COVID pandemic and to those deeply traumatically affected by it. I think this is a discussion that will be continuing going, and this is just one of the first, not first, but one of the ongoing spaces of where to talk about this. I don't know if Dr. Jetelina wanted to respond to anything as any last comments?
No, but thank you guys for creating this space. We need more spaces like this, and I hope that they're coming. But this is one of the first ones I've been invited to, so it was an honor and a privilege.
Yes, of course. And this recording will also be uploaded to our YouTube account. It should be Rituals in the Making. And you can also check out our website for further events or for dispatches or learning more about the research that we're continuing on doing. So with that, I thank everyone for coming and for your great questions and comments. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.